The oxygen alarm had barely started to blink before the cockpit lights erupted into a sea of red. Inside, the KC-135 panic gripped the cabin like a vice. Captain Miller slumped forward motionless, his head striking the throttle as the aircraft jolted into a sharp dip. The co-pilot's hands trembled over the controls, breath-ragged eyes darting for help that wasn't coming. Warning lights flooded the overhead panel, and the radio spat static instead of orders. Passengers strapped in tight exchanged terrified glances, no one daring to move, no one knowing what to do. Near the back of the aircraft, Elena Mitchell already had her headset on, her eyes locked on the system panel. She knew those readings didn't match what they should be. She had seen the signs at takeoff, but no one had listened. Another violent lurch cut through the airframe and the plane dropped hard. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered a prayer. Elena unbuckled her harness and stood. A voice barked from the front. "Don't move, stay in your seat." Regulations, they said. Not your place, they said. But Elena had rebuilt this aircraft bolt by bolt. She didn't need permission to know it was failing. The co-pilot's voice cracked over the intercom. "We're losing altitude. I don't know what's wrong. I don't know what to do." Elena started walking. A crew member blocked her path, face pale, eyes wide. "You can't," he stammered. "You're not authorized." Her voice was calm but sharp. "If I don't, none of us are going home." No one responded. The only sound was the low groan of a dying aircraft. She placed her hand on the bulkhead door, looked toward the cockpit, and made a choice. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't in command. But she was the only one who understood this machine. As the aircraft shuddered again, dropping farther into open sky, Elena stepped forward into the chaos, not because she was allowed, because she had to. Part 1. Elena, the invisible expert. Elena Mitchell had grease in her veins before she even understood what a wrench was. Her earliest memories were of her grandfather's garage outside Lubbock, where he rebuilt old airplane engines with the kind of focus most people reserved for prayer. He used to say machines talked if you listened hard enough, and Elena believed him. At 14, she could identify a misfire by ear. By 16, she had overhauled her first engine solo, with her grandfather watching silently from the corner. He never bragged, just nodded, then handed her a shop towel like it was a medal. After high school, she enlisted in the Navy, not because she wanted medals or rank, but because she wanted time with real aircraft. 6 years later, she left with a reputation for being quiet, thorough, and unsettlingly good at spotting problems before they happened. She wasn't loud, but she was right, and people came to respect that in their own quiet way. Thunder Ridge Air Force Base hired her as a civilian contractor soon after. The old hangars, the midnight smells of jet fuel and steel, the sound of hydraulic systems spinning down in the dark, they felt like home. She preferred working alone before sunrise, when no one was watching, when she could listen to the planes without distraction. Elena wasn't one for uniforms. She wore oil-streaked coveralls. Her name faded on the patch, her brown hair pulled into a loose bun that never lasted past breakfast. Her boots were scuffed, her hands always stained. She moved through the base like a ghost with a tool belt. People called her the aircraft whisperer. It wasn't official, but it stuck. She never asked for the nickname, never acknowledged it out loud, but it meant more than any rank ever could. To her, it meant they knew she understood. She didn't mind being a civilian. She liked being on the edges of things, solving problems without needing salutes or formalities. What she didn't like was how certain officers treated her like she didn't belong, like her years in uniform didn't count just because the uniform had changed. Elena didn't complain. She kept her head down and her work meticulous. She logged every bolt she tightened, every pressure gauge she recalibrated. Her notes were cleaner than most flight manuals. She didn't talk much in meetings, but when she did, people listened. At least the ones who understood what was at stake. The others, the ones who lived by rigid command and titles, often dismissed her as just the mechanic. That never stopped her from doing the job right. She never forgot the lesson her grandfather repeated until the day he died. You don't need to wear stripes to know what you're doing. You just need to be sure even when no one else is. That was how she operated. With quiet certainty. With tools and knowledge. With her back to the noise and her eyes on the aircraft. Thunder Ridge was full of people in sharp uniforms with medals and polished boots. Elena moved among them with soft footsteps and a brain full of schematics. No ceremony, no rank, just purpose. Every time she touched an aircraft, she treated it like something alive. She'd feel the pulse in the hydraulics, the breathing in the airflow sensors, the heartbeat in the engines. If something was off, she knew. Most days, no one noticed her work until something went wrong. And when it didn't go wrong, no one said anything at all. She was fine with that. Silence usually meant she'd done her job right. But sometimes she wondered if they'd ever see her for what she really was. Not a helper, not a backup, but someone who had earned her place through grit, not glory. That morning before the test flight, Elena wiped her hands on a faded rag and looked up at the KC-135 sitting quietly in the hangar. It was just her and the bird in that moment, alone in the pale light of dawn. She tilted her head slightly, listening, almost like she was waiting for the plane to speak. And maybe in some way it did. Not with words, but with pressure readings and fuel flow rhythms and vibrations too subtle for most people to notice. But she did. She always had. Part 2. The flight. No one expected. Thunder Ridge. Air Force Base woke before the sun. In the half-light of morning, boots echoed against concrete, and the cold air smelled faintly of fuel and scorched metal. It was a place of structure, of ranks and routines, where every salute had a weight, and every order came sharp and fast. Colonel Grant ran it like a machine. Tall, pressed, always composed, he expected rules to be followed and boundaries to be respected. To him, civilians were tolerated, not trusted, and Elena Mitchell was no exception. He didn't like how she walked the hangar like she belonged. He didn't like how others spoke of her with quiet respect. And he certainly didn't like that she understood the aircraft almost too well. The test flight that morning wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Routine systems check, post-repair verification. Elena had replaced a faulty valve the night before and double-checked her work 3 times. Still, she'd requested to ride along just to monitor the performance in real time. Grant signed off with cold reluctance. He made it clear to her and to everyone else on that crew. You are not crew. You are not certified. You are a contractor, and nothing more. Elena nodded like always. She didn't argue. She just gathered her tools and her notebook and moved on. The KC-135 stood in the center of Hangar Bay 4, quiet and enormous. Elena approached it with the same quiet reverence she always did. She walked along the fuselage, hand lightly brushing the rivets, eyes scanning the details no one else noticed. Inside, she slid into the observer seat and began noting initial readings. The hydraulic pressure held steady, but the recovery time on the auxiliary system felt slow. Just a little. Just enough. She wrote it down, drew a quick sketch of the flow pattern, and circled the pressure slope. It was within limits. But wrong. Her grandfather's voice whispered through her thoughts. Machines don't lie, Mija. They just wait for someone who listens. She remembered standing beside him when she was 11 holding a flashlight while he adjusted a cracked exhaust line on an old Beechcraft. He tapped the pipe with his knuckle and listened. Hear that? That's not how she should sound. Elena stared at the readings again. It looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. The KC-135 wasn't just a plane. It was a pattern, a pulse, a behavior she had studied for years. Captain Miller arrived cheerful and steady, followed by co-pilot Lieutenant Hayes, who looked nervous but focused. The rest of the crew boarded in order, joking quietly as they strapped in. To them, this was just a flight. To Elena, it felt like a question waiting to be answered. Colonel Grant made one last appearance before they sealed the doors. He walked up to her seat with a clipboard and a stare that could cut steel. His voice dropped low. Observation only. Stay in your lane. She gave the smallest nod. He paused, studied her like she was a faulty component, then turned and walked off the aircraft. The hatch shut behind him with a hiss that lingered longer than it should have. Elena clipped her harness, adjusted her headset, and focused on the monitor. Her hands moved over the panel with practiced calm. As the engines began to hum to life, her heart tightened. The pressure readings jumped slightly as fuel flow ramped, still within parameters, still off. She tilted her head and closed her eyes for just a moment. That wasn't how this aircraft usually responded. The delay between hydraulic cycle and pressurization was too sluggish, barely a second. But she knew this aircraft. It had never been sluggish. The engines roared louder and the whole body of the plane vibrated as it rolled toward the runway. Elena opened her notebook again and underlined the same line twice. Aux system hesitation. Recheck. The vibration felt uneven under her boots. Not unstable, just unfamiliar, a kind of drag in the climb sequence that others might chalk up to aging parts or weather variation, but she didn't believe in coincidences. She glanced toward the front where Miller and Hayes were running checklists and bantering with tower control. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded like a plane about to fly. But inside her something felt off. Not broken. Not dangerous. Not yet. She didn't say anything. There wasn't a line for gut feeling in the pre-flight manual. She just stared at the readings and waited. Something was wrong. It hadn't said it yet, but she could feel the silence pressing in. Machines don't scream when something's about to go wrong. They whisper. And only people who've spent their lives listening know when to speak up. Elena wrote down one last line in her notes. Be ready. Part 3. Stay in your lane, mechanic. Sub-Part 3.1, tension builds. It started with a flicker. The oxygen alarm blinked once, then stopped. The indicator dipped just below threshold for a second, then stabilized. No one in the cockpit seemed to notice. Captain Miller was in the middle of confirming altitude. Lieutenant Hayes was fumbling with a radio frequency that kept dropping static into his headset. Elena felt the shift in her gut before she saw it again on the panel. The pressure lag was back. The same delay she noted earlier had returned, only now it was deeper. Her hand reached instinctively for her notebook, but the pen never made it to the page. Captain Miller let out a strange sound, a soft cough that cracked midway. His head dropped forward onto the throttle, motionless. The plane jolted as his weight pushed the controls. Elena snapped her gaze toward the cockpit. Hayes froze. His eyes darted from the instruments to the unconscious pilot, his mouth opening, but no words coming. The aircraft dipped slightly, just enough to rattle everything loose inside her chest. She pressed her headset tighter, scanning the readings. Oxygen distribution failure. The backup system wasn't kicking in fast enough. Her heart punched against her ribs. Hayes finally managed to speak, his voice high and shaky. We've lost the captain. I need help. Elena unbuckled her harness without thinking. The moment she stood, Marcus, the flight engineer, blocked her path. His arm stretched across the aisle like a wall. His voice came sharp and loud. You're not cleared to approach the cockpit. Elena stared at him. Her mouth opened to protest, but her voice caught in her throat. The plane tilted again, more aggressively this time. A ripple of panic passed through the cabin. She gritted her teeth. That slow pressure climbed the weak auxiliary pump. It was all connected. She'd written it down, flagged it, watched it unfold, and now it was failing in real time. Let me through. She said it low, controlled. Marcus shook his head. You're a mechanic, not flight crew. Sit down. The cabin lights flickered, and a groan rumbled through the aircraft as it lost more altitude. Elena's hands curled into fists. She had the knowledge. She had trained for this. She had seen this exact scenario in simulation dozens of times. But simulations didn't come with walls of protocol and men like Colonel Grant. Simulations didn't come with fear that your job, your name, your entire career could vanish in one moment of defiance. The co-pilot's voice broke over the intercom again. We're losing oxygen. Controls feel sluggish. I don't know what's going on. She knew. Every part of her knew. She had built systems like this, torn them apart, tested them under stress. This was a cascade failure, one mistake triggering another. The air in the cabin felt thinner, not just because of pressure, but because time was running out. And all she could do was stand there, blocked, listening to a machine she understood better than anyone on board screaming for her to act. She looked past Marcus to the cockpit door. Her instincts told her to move, to push through, to take control. But her training told her to wait. Follow orders. Know your place. She stood frozen in that terrible in-between, with lives on the line and rules chaining her to the floor. Sub-Part 3.2. Defiance in the air. Elena took one step forward. Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip tight with panic. His voice cracked as he repeated the rule she already knew by heart. No civilian passed the cockpit barrier. She looked him dead in the eye. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. Something in the belly of the aircraft groaned under the strain. Behind the cockpit door, the co-pilot's voice had turned into a broken string of half-commands and static. He wasn't handling it. He was falling apart. The plane didn't need regulations right now. It needed someone who understood exactly what was failing and how to stop it. She spoke quietly, but with weight. You've watched me work for 3 years. You've seen me fix things no one else could. Do you really want to bet against that now? Marcus hesitated. Just long enough. Her arm slipped from his grasp as she moved. Her boots hit the deck with a surety she didn't even feel, but her body carried her forward like it already knew what came next. She reached the cockpit door and pulled it open. Hayes turned wide-eyed and drenched in sweat. His hands hovered uselessly over the controls, his voice shaking. He looked like a man already in freefall. Elena didn't wait for permission. She slid into the empty seat and wrapped her hands around the yoke. It felt right. Terrifying. But right. Hayes tried to speak. Regulations, chain of command authority. All the things she had heard her entire career. She cut through it with a single sentence. This isn't about protocol. This is about keeping us alive. The control surfaces were still responding, but slow. She adjusted trim manually and pulled up just enough to fight the descent. The aircraft leveled for the first time in minutes. She scanned the panel. Her eyes moved fast, tracing lines of failure through the electrical system and backup oxygen array. She'd seen this combination in a sim 3 years ago. One misstep could blow the circuit that kept the rudder stable. Her breath stayed steady. Every move calculated. She wasn't improvising. She was executing muscle memory born from hours in a simulator no one cared she'd passed. The plane stopped dropping. Not fully stable, but no longer falling. Hayes leaned back in his seat, staring at her like he'd just seen someone walk out of fire without a scratch. Outside the window, the horizon evened out. Not safe yet, but still airborne. Still in her hands. Elena didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The aircraft had said everything she needed to hear, and she was finally answering. Part 4. The landing only she could make. Subpart 4.1. On the edge. Elena kept her hands steady on the yoke, eyes locked on the panel in front of her. The systems were bleeding out in slow motion, not catastrophic yet, but unraveling one by one. Her fingers moved without hesitation, toggling secondary circuits, trimming airflow, adjusting for pressure drop. The radio crackled in her headset. Base command was shouting, demanding identification authority answers. She clicked the volume down and shut it out. She didn't have time for explanations. Every second counted. She needed to feel the aircraft, not defend her place in it. The plane groaned as the right side stabilizer drifted out of sync. Elena corrected with a soft touch, not overcompensating. The KC-135 responded with a low whine like it was trying to breathe again. She could hear the crew behind her whispering voices laced with panic and disbelief. Some were angry, some stunned, but none of them had a plan. Her focus stayed narrow. Trim at 3% down, rudder pressure running high on the left. She slid into problem-solving mode like slipping on an old coat. The cockpit lit up again, another warning flashing across the screen. Oxygen backup had failed completely. She rerouted manually, forcing airflow through the emergency bypass. Colonel Grant's voice came through clear and furious. "Remove the contractor. Resume proper command." Elena exhaled slow and even. The stick felt warm in her palms, like it recognized her. Like the machine knew she wasn't guessing. She wasn't hoping. She was guiding. She scanned the instruments again. Hydraulic stress was spiking. That meant the elevator response would lag just barely. She adjusted her pitch in anticipation. The aircraft bucked once like it was testing her. She didn't flinch. She met the resistance with balance and resolve. Hayes sat beside her, silent now. He glanced at her, eyes wide, but no longer fighting. She could tell he was starting to believe. The systems were stabilizing, not perfect, but manageable. The descent had slowed, the nose lifted back toward level. She tuned out every voice that told her no, every order barked by someone who wasn't inside this cockpit, every judgment about what she was supposed to be. All that mattered was this aircraft, its signals, its needs, its weight shifting beneath her. She knew every bolt of it like second nature. Her grandfather's words came back in a whisper. "You don't fly a machine. You listen to it. You earn its trust." Elena wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here to take credit. She was here to bring them home. Subpart 4.2. Her hands know the plane. Elena adjusted the trim one more time and glanced at the pressure gauges. She spoke clearly, more to the aircraft than anyone else. The left hydraulic system is running about 4 psi low when the auxiliary pump cycles. That's throwing off the trim response just slightly. Lieutenant Hayes blinked at her, confused. She didn't look at him. She kept watching the readings like they were breathing. She tapped the altitude hold indicator. Elevator response is delayed by half a second. That's not normal, but I've seen it on this airframe before. It needs a bit more input during descent or we'll overcorrect and dip hard. Hayes reached for the controls, hesitated, then tried to take over. She didn't fight him, just kept flying. Her voice stayed steady. You don't know this aircraft. You don't know its quirks. I do. He stared at her like she had said something absurd. Then he looked down at the gauges and froze. Everything she described was happening exactly as she said it would. Elena continued. The right side rudder cable pulls slightly tight when cabin pressure drops below 9.8. That's why we're drifting left. Not a major issue unless you try to compensate the wrong way. The aircraft trembled again, but less violently this time. She smoothed it out without a second thought. Her fingers moved across the panel like she was tuning an instrument. Hayes leaned back, his hands slowly falling from the controls. His eyes were wide now, but his voice was quiet. He asked how she knew all this. She finally looked at him. Because I rebuilt every part of this plane. I've logged over 300 hours in simulators. I've studied this system inside and out for years. This isn't theory. It's familiarity. Marcus stood behind them, arms crossed, still unsure. Elena didn't turn around. She just kept speaking. The fuel crossover valve runs sluggish on this aircraft. It throws off balance during banking unless you feather it in stages. No one questioned her now. They listened. Not because she demanded it, but because everything she said was true. The aircraft held altitude. The readings started to settle. The panic in the cabin had quieted to silence. Hayes nodded slowly, then said what none of them had said before. You're the one who should be flying. Elena didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just kept her eyes on the sky ahead and her hands on the aircraft she knew better than anyone alive. Part 5. From Mechanic to Hero. Sub Part 5.1. The Aftermath. The runway came into view through the haze, a flat gray strip stretching across the desert floor. Elena narrowed her focus to the numbers, the rate of descent, the slight tug on the yoke that signaled pressure loss near the tail. The aircraft was still hurting, but it was stable enough to land. She spoke softly as she made final adjustments. Manual flaps 30 degrees, nose trimmed slightly high. Touchdown target 300 feet past the threshold. The cockpit stayed quiet except for the hum of the engines and the measured rhythm of her breathing. Hayes sat beside her, no longer trying to help, just watching. He looked more like a student now than a soldier. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a softness that made the whole crew sit straighter. The aircraft settled cleanly onto the runway, no bounce, no roll. Just quiet. Practiced precision. Elena guided it down the centerline brakes, easing on pressure, balanced. As the plane rolled to a stop, a gust of wind tapped the fuselage like a final exhale. Everything held. Through the cockpit window, she saw ground crews rushing forward, followed by a line of officers. At the front stood Colonel Grant, arms crossed, face like stone. He wasn't there to congratulate anyone. Elena powered down the systems, her hands moving in perfect sequence. She sat for a second longer, letting the silence settle in her chest. The aircraft was safe. Everyone was alive. She unstrapped and opened the hatch. The sun hit her face as she stepped onto the tarmac. Boots thudded behind her. Marcus and Hayes followed, still stunned. Then the command voice cut across the air like a blade. Elena Mitchell, you are under arrest for unauthorized control of a military aircraft. Grant's voice was loud, sharp, and final. 2 MPs flanked him, stepping forward with handcuffs already drawn. No one moved. Elena stood still, her expression unreadable. She didn't argue. She had expected this. Then a second voice rose behind her, weak but clear. Hold on. Captain Miller appeared in the hatch, leaning heavily on the frame, pale and sweating but conscious. He climbed down slowly, one step at a time, like every word he had to say was keeping him upright. He walked past Elena and stopped between her and the MPs. His voice shook, but his words landed like thunder. She saved all of us. You're not arresting her. Grant's face twisted. You were unconscious. You don't know what happened up there. Miller straightened his spine just enough. I heard enough. I heard her fly that thing better than anyone I've ever seen in 20 years of service. The MPs stopped. Behind them, a crowd was forming. Ground crews, technicians, flight officers, people who had worked beside Elena for years. One of the younger mechanics stepped forward, arms crossed. She's the reason half our fleet's still in the air. You don't get to treat her like a problem. Rachel, the communications specialist, walked up next. She'd barely spoken during the flight, but now her voice cut through the crowd. If she hadn't taken over, we'd be in pieces across the desert right now. Even Marcus, still rattled, found his voice. You know what I thought at first? That she was just pushing her luck. But I was wrong. She flew that plane with hands that knew every inch of it. Grant looked around and saw something he didn't expect. No one was backing him. Not one. He took a step back, lips pressed, tight fists clenched, but the moment had shifted. It didn't belong to him anymore. Elena didn't say a word. She stood quietly, tools still on her belt grease, still on her collar. For the first time, no one looked past her. They looked at her. Not as a mechanic, not as a civilian, but as the reason they were standing on solid ground. Subpart 5.2. The Hearing. The hearing took place in a narrow, windowless room lined with flags and silence. Elena sat at a long table, shoulders squared, hands folded on a thin folder of documents she knew by heart. Across from her sat Colonel Grant, stiff and unreadable, flanked by a base attorney, who looked more tired than angry. Colonel Hayes from the Inspector General's office opened the session with clipped words. They were here to examine the emergency actions taken aboard Flight 412 and assess any violations or misconduct. Elena's name was read first, but not as a defendant, as a witness. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once and waited. Grant barely moved. The first question came directly to him. Did he order Elena removed from the cockpit mid-emergency? He cleared his throat and answered without emotion. She is not flight certified. She had no authority to operate the aircraft. My directive was in line with protocol. Hayes adjusted her glasses. And did your directive take into account the fact that Captain Miller was unconscious and your co-pilot incapacitated? Grant paused. She had no authority, he repeated. The fact remains she violated the chain of command. Hayes turned to Elena. What was the first thing you noticed was wrong during the flight? Elena kept her voice level. A 1.2-second delay in auxiliary pressure stabilization, followed by unstable oxygen distribution. Both matched a known failure pattern I'd studied in simulator training. And did you alert anyone? Yes. I documented it and planned a follow-up on landing. I wasn't in a position to stop the flight from proceeding. Hayes nodded. And once the failure escalated, I waited until it was clear that the crew could not correct the emergency. Then I took control to stabilize the aircraft and prevent further descent. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because there was no other option. The base attorney leaned forward. Miss Mitchell, do you hold a flight license? No. I hold over 300 hours of simulator training logged during active duty in the Navy. I've spent over a decade maintaining these aircraft. I knew how to manage the systems in front of me. There was a pause. Then Hayes produced a document from the folder. It was a transcript from the flight's internal comms. The room listened to the scratchy voice of Grant shouting for Elena to be removed even after the aircraft was recovering. Another voice followed. Lieutenant Hayes saying he had no idea what to do. Then Elena's voice, calm and direct, stating system anomalies and exact response patterns. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Hayes turned back to Grant. We also have emails from you requesting her contract be terminated months before the flight, including language that reads, she has too much technical confidence for a civilian. She disrupts the chain of command. Grant's jaw tightened. My concerns were about security. Hayes didn't look away. Your concerns were about control. Captain Miller stepped in, then slow but steady. I've flown for 20 years. I've never seen a more composed, knowledgeable person in the air. She didn't endanger lives. She saved them. Grant shifted in his chair. The weight in the room had moved. One by one, members of the maintenance crew submitted statements. Technicians, flight engineers, even the tower operator who watched the landing unfold. Chief Master Sergeant Reeves, a veteran of 3 decades, stood last. She brought that plane down cleaner than most of our certified pilots. I watched it myself. If she isn't qualified, we need to rewrite the definition. There was nothing left to say. Hayes turned to Elena. The findings conclude that you acted with professionalism, competence, and restraint under extreme circumstances. You are hereby reinstated with full access to all contractor duties. Elena breathed steady but full. It wasn't celebration, it was relief. One more sentence followed. You will also be formally commended for your actions with a citation of exceptional civilian heroism under crisis. Grant said nothing. He stood, then walked out without a word. Elena didn't watch him go. She gathered her folder, nodded once to the room, and walked out into the sun. Not a mechanic looking for permission, but a professional who had earned her place and finally been heard. The morning sun broke clean over Thunder Ridge Air Force Base, casting soft shadows across the hangars and runways. Elena Mitchell stood just outside Hangar Bay 2, her helmet tucked under one arm, her flight suit zipped neat and snug. The air still smelled like fuel and dust and morning ambition. Her old toolbox sat next to her boots, the red paint chipped at the edges from years of service. She hadn't used it as much lately, but she brought it out today anyway. Some habits were worth keeping. Across the tarmac, the KC-135 waited in silence, the same tail number she had saved all those months ago. 839. She smiled when she saw it. That plane had nearly killed her, and somehow it had also given her everything. The certification came 2 months after the hearing. It wasn't fast, but it was fair. Hayes pushed it through, backed by every name Elena never thought would stand beside hers. She passed every exam, every simulation, every check ride, but she didn't need paper to tell her she was ready. She'd already proven it when it mattered most. Now she ran her fingers along the edge of the fuselage, feeling for imperfections out of instinct. The aircraft was perfect, but she checked anyway. It was never about the checklist. It was about the feel. Her flight suit still had oil stains near the cuffs. She hadn't bought a new one yet. She liked what the old marks reminded her of. She climbed into the cockpit without fanfare. No audience, no drama, just her and the machine she knew like a heartbeat. Hayes walked by with a clipboard, caught her eye, and gave a nod. It wasn't admiration. It was respect. She returned the nod and powered on the main console. The systems came alive, slow and familiar. The same soft hum, the same green lights. Only now she sat in the pilot's seat with the authority to match her skill. She ran through pre-flight like muscle memory, engine check, control surface response, fuel balance. She paused when she reached the oxygen system. She remembered the flicker, the dip, the fear. Then she smiled. This time it was flawless. Outside, a breeze rolled across the tarmac, carrying the scent of jet wash and desert air. Her grandfather would have called it flying weather. She could almost hear him just over her shoulder, quiet and proud. The headset clicked on, clearance confirmed. Ground control gave her the runway. Her hands moved to the throttle. She didn't rush. She took a breath and let her body relax into the seat. The moment didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be hers. As the plane rolled forward, picking up speed, the hangars slipped out of view behind her. In the mirror of the cockpit glass, she saw her reflection. Same steady eyes, same quiet strength, only now framed by new wings on her chest. She lifted off smooth and even, not a bump in the climb. As the ground fell away, Thunder Ridge shrank into the flat line of the earth. She didn't feel nervous. She felt free. Above the clouds, she leveled off and looked around. Just sky, just light, just peace. She hadn't chased this. She had earned it. Every bolt turned, every note taken, every moment she chose to listen instead of speak. Elena smiled to herself, adjusted the trim, and whispered under her breath, "Still flying, old girl. Still listening. Still home." The hangar buzzed with the usual rhythm of turning wrenches and rolling tool carts. Elena walked through the space she'd called home for over a decade now, with people greeting her by name, not just nodding from behind clipboards. She still wore the same oil-stained coveralls, but now they looked different to others. Marcus handed her a torque wrench with a grin. No hesitation, no tension, just teamwork. She checked the gear alignment on a grounded trainer aircraft, her hands steady, her mind calm. Everything moved smoother these days, not because the work had changed, but because she had been seen. Out on the tarmac, Martinez jogged to catch up with her. The young tech was fresh from certification, sharp but still finding her footing. She asked if she could shadow Elena during maintenance hours. Elena gave a quiet smile, told her to meet her at 6 the next morning before the noise started, the same way her grandfather had taught her. Later that afternoon, she walked past the east wall of Hangar Bay 4. A new plaque had been mounted there just last week, brushed bronze with clean lines. It read, "For extraordinary courage, clarity, and commitment to flight integrity, civilian technician Elena Mitchell." She paused and looked at it for a long time. Then she touched it once with the back of her hand and moved on. Back in her corner of the maintenance office, her toolbox sat open. The top tray held a worn cloth, an old pressure gauge, and her grandfather's dog tag still looped on a frayed cord. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out the small silver wings she'd been given at certification. For a moment she held them in her palm, letting the weight settle. Not heavy, just full. She didn't frame them or polish them. She laid them beside the wrench her grandfather gave her the day she rebuilt her first engine. Then she closed the lid soft and final. At her desk, a letter had arrived in a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Captain Miller. No speech, no summary. Just a line at the end that said, "You reminded all of us what it really means to be qualified." The hangar lights flickered as the sun dipped behind the control tower. The last aircraft of the day rumbled into its bay. Elena stepped outside, hands in her pockets, boots scraping the gravel. She looked up at the sky, same as always, same wide blue, same silence, but everything in her felt different. Machines still whispered, and she still listened. In the quiet, she heard her grandfather's voice like it had never left. "Real work speaks for itself, mija. You just have to know how to hear it."